Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session on community boards. My name is Emily, and I am the citywide engagement advocate here at Open Plants. And with us here today, we have our Chief Strategy Officer, Sarah Land, and Jay Brown, who will be joining us later on. He is a Brooklyn Community Board member. And then we also have Eric Parker, who is our Events and Operations Coordinator. Alrighty. So thanks so much for joining us. So following the presentation, I'm going to be fielding questions from the chat, and you're welcome to drop any questions that you might have in the Q&A section as we go. And if you'd like to directly ask your questions to Sarah and Jay, which we strongly encourage, feel free to raise your hand and then we can bring you on as a panelist during the Q&A session. So in the meantime, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat by writing your name, what community board you live in or are interested in joining, and why you're interested in joining. We'd love to know. Alrighty, so let's get started with who we are as an organization. Open Plans is a nonprofit here in the city advocating for livable streets and safe and joyful public spaces in all neighborhoods. And we do this through tactical urbanism, grassroots advocacy, and policy. We also recently started organizing last October for some of our campaigns that include eliminating parking mandates, advocating for an Office of Public Space Management, and reforming the curb. We believe that every New Yorker, no matter what borough or neighborhood you live in, should have equal access to public spaces and streets that protect all users. And so through our community board campaign, we have been able to connect with different boards of the city. And while meeting with these different neighborhoods, we learned that there's this huge appetite to join a community board and become more involved. But most times folks really just don't know where to start, what resources are available. So this is why we really wanted to create this webinar series to hopefully give some folks the right information and answer any questions that they might have so that they feel better prepared to apply and join a board. So community boards are made up to 50 members, and they vary depending on where you live. So some boards might have more vacancies than others, and that might make it a little bit more competitive, but it varies. So they are appointed by the borough president and the city council member, and they can also even be nominated by community board members. So it's really helpful to kind of get to know who's in office in your neighborhood and really just set up a meeting if you have time to, or if you know anybody that works there. Community board members serve 2-year terms, and then they can be reappointed after that. As of 2019, though, there are term limits in place. So the first limits will start in 2027, and that limits community board members to 4 2-year terms. So that is something worth noting. But before that, folks could be on their board for really as long as they wanted to, which obviously isn't always the best case. So while community board members themselves are volunteers, they are given a budget, and this budget covers the district manager's salary and any staff that they may have, in addition to other little board costs here and there. And the main responsibility of the district manager's office is to receive and resolve the complaints that constituents call about. And so if they would like for them to be addressed, but they also serve as a community resource, whether it's for housing applications or block parties or street fairs. So it's really important. They're pretty important, and they're really helpful to get to know, and always, call them if you have any issues in your neighborhood that you would like to be addressed. So even though these boards play more of an advisory role, they do have tremendous influence with what happens in their community. And they're often consulted by city agencies like the Department of Transportation, for example, on land use and zoning matters. And they also meet with these agencies to make recommendations on the city budget. But most importantly, they serve as advocates and a voice for their neighborhood. So it's really important, that we have these strong voices on the board. And so, because they are so influential, these strong voices are super important, and that way we can ensure that community boards have members that are dedicated to making our streets and our city more livable, and that the decisions align with all constituents and not just who's on the board. So I'm going to pass this over now to Sarah, and you're welcome And I'll be monitoring questions in the chat, so you're welcome to drop them in as we go. I'll save that towards the end, and yeah, thank you all.
Awesome. Thanks, Emily. So once again, Sarah Lind, I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Open Plans. I am also a member of Community Board 7 on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Today, I am, of course, speaking in my personal capacity about my experience as a board member, not on behalf of the board. So, part of why we are doing this series and why we really encourage you to apply to your community board is because currently, many community boards are not representative of the neighborhoods that they are supposed to represent. Some of these are getting better. There are some borough presidents who are committed to better representation, but we still find issues with community boards being more likely to be composed of people who are homeowners or who have cars and drive around the city. This is a few reasons. Of course, if you own a home in a district, you have a bit more of an investment in it. But if you can go to the next slide. What ends up happening then is that people, take votes that benefit them personally. They might not even think that they're doing that, right? They might see their perspective as the one that's what matters to them. But we see that when people are more likely to be homeowners, they're more likely to care about their property value versus maybe other issues that matter to renters in the district or even people who work there or pass through there. So, having more representation on the board of people from diverse backgrounds, diverse, places they live, people who use public transit, not just cars, is really important so that all of those perspectives are represented, not just the perspectives of, say, homeowners or car owners. So, we're talking here about applying, and we hope you will apply, but there are lots of ways to get involved, and so we'll go through those. I think Emily mentioned your community board meets once a month, and then there are also lots of committees, and those committee meetings usually have a meeting once a month as well. So as a first step, we really encourage you to show up at the meetings. They are supposed to put their agendas and meeting times on their website. Sometimes the agendas are put up very late, but keeping an eye on that, keeping your ear to the ground in terms of what those committees are going to be talking about, so when there's maybe a resolution that's of particular interest to you, and then showing up. You can always just show up and kind of listen, especially if it's your first time. But we, of course, really encourage you to speak up, to make your opinion and your perspective heard. Usually, if you go to a committee meeting, you have a little bit more opportunity to speak. Those are smaller meetings, and you might be able to have almost a conversation. Generally, at a full board meeting, they limit public speaking to, say, 2 to 3 minutes. There is a public session usually in which you can kind of sign up and spend 2 to 3 minutes talking about anything you want. So you might just say, hi, I'm a resident and I'm really concerned about street safety in the district. Here's some things I think you guys should be talking about. Or, if you work at a library and you want to talk about that, you can talk about anything you want to. And then also usually if they are talking about a specific resolution that you're interested in, you can sign up to speak on that resolution as well when it comes up. Next slide. You can go back. Sorry. Yeah. So, you can also get involved in community groups in your district that might be showing up to the board to speak. That's always a good way when you go, with a group of advocates. That always makes it a bit easier. I noticed that someone said in the chat that they're a public member. So maybe later that person might want to come up and talk a little bit about that. We don't actually have public members on CV7, so I'm not as familiar with it, but some boards in the city have public members. So this is someone who hasn't been appointed to the board, maybe doesn't have the full commitment that others do, but is allowed to vote on resolutions usually, I believe. Sorry, my cat. And then, kind of shows up at meetings and has a bit more sway than just a member of the public coming. And then, of course, we hope you'll go the fully in and apply to join your community board. All of those applications are open now. And so now we'll go into a little bit more detail on that. So, thanks, Pedro. We'll maybe bring you up when we get to Q&A. That'd be great. So, what does it mean to be on your community board? Emily mentioned a bit before, but to go into more details, you are there, you're an official appointee, a political appointee of the borough president and possibly also your council member. You are part of what is kind of technically a city agency. You are a volunteer. You are representing, of course, your own perspective, but you are also expected to consider the needs of the whole neighborhood. And specifically around kind of streets issues, you might be able to weigh in on neighborhood projects, including plazas, open streets. If there's a bike lane coming in, which is always usually a bit of an interesting conversation, going to community events, things like that. Next slide. So a little bit more of the technical, what it means to be on a board. Usually you are expected to sit on 2 committees. There's a bunch of different committees, and each board has maybe slightly different committees. Of course, if you're here, we hope you would be interested in sitting on whatever the transportation committee is. They sometimes have slightly different names, but those would be the committees that consider things like bike lanes or open streets, things like that. So you'd be expected to go to 2 committee meetings each month, and then also the full board meeting each month. Yeah, they're usually on weekday meetings. My board used to only go off in August. Now we go off in July and August. I think a lot of boards do that. So you have a little bit of a summer break. But that time commitment of 3 meetings a month is something to keep in mind. If you're going to be a community board member, a lot of why you're there is to make your voice heard. So being able to speak up is important. Talking, making your point of view heard, helps to advance the issues that you care about. So being ready to show up in a meeting and speak out is important. And of course, we all, or many of us, feel very passionately about these issues, but staying grounded, staying true to your principles, and speaking calmly, being open to other people's perspectives, empathetic to the needs of community members who might show up, is all important for being a good community board member. So there's the committees that we mentioned about in the board. There are also other opportunities to get involved. Most boards have some kind of executive committee made up of the board chair, maybe vice chair, secretary, treasurer. There are a few different, configurations of that. Usually you run for those positions, and there's a board election, which, can be fun. And usually if you're in one of those positions, you'd also be expected to attend a steering committee meeting each month. So that would be 4 meetings, and you might have some other responsibilities, meeting as an executive committee to discuss particular issues, resolutions that are coming up that you think you need some prep for. So there's some of those things. Another thing that anyone can do, whether you're, there's also, sorry, to say that you can be the chair of the committee as well, chair of the full board or chair of your committee. Another thing that any member can do is to introduce a resolution. A resolution is basically saying, here's a problem that we have identified. Maybe we have identified that this particular intersection in the district is particularly unsafe. We've looked at the data, this many crashes occur there, this many injuries. It seems that the problem is that these people make a left turn and it's unsafe. The evidence shows that having a no left turn at intersections like this increases safety. Therefore, be it resolved, we call on DOT to install a no left turn sign there. So that's kind of what a resolution might look like. And anyone can introduce that. We've even had community members come and say, hey, this is an issue I'm bringing to your attention, and then we'll pass a resolution on it. So those are the kind of things that anyone can introduce. Some of the committees also have more kind of official things that they are responsible for. So a couple of the kind of technical responsibilities of a community board are to approve liquor licenses for bars and restaurants in the community board's catchment area. So, anytime one of those is applying for a liquor license, they know they have to come to the community board and get a resolution approving it. Land use issues, a variance on a landmarked building has to come to the community board. Anytime there's a rezoning, that will have to get approval from the community board. So there are a few things like that have to come, and that's kind of a standard process. And then there's this other way that you can introduce a resolution. I think that's good on that, unless people have more questions when we open it up later. Okay, so kind of the interesting stuff here we wanted to make sure to talk to you about is how to apply and how to make your application as strong as possible so you get appointed. Because just to say, a lot of these community boards are, pretty full. Not that many people drop off each year, so there might only be a few openings. There are some around the city that have more openings and would be less competitive, but usually community board applications are fairly competitive, so making your application strong is important. So a few things to do now. Start attending community board meetings. This can be committee meetings, full board meetings. Usually in your application, you will be asked if you have attended meetings in the past. If you're applying next month, just try to get to a few now, and then maybe you're thinking about applying next year. So start attending, now as many as you can. Also, just getting involved in your community generally. Usually you'll have an opportunity on the application to talk about issues in your community, how you're involved, and being able to show, that you're a member of your block association or your tenants association, or, you're part of the local, food bank or whatever it is. Some kind of way that you're involved in your local neighborhood will really show your commitment and that you understand the local issues. And then this one, for better or for worse, these are political appointments. So getting to know your council member and your borough president is really important. And, you can do that by showing up at events that they might be at, introducing yourself, offering to maybe volunteer with their office. Sometimes there are ways that they're looking for volunteers, go out and help them canvass for a particular issue their office is involved in. There's sometimes opportunities to volunteer for participatory budgeting. So finding ways to get involved is great. And then once you do kind of know that person, also flagging for them that you've applied is really important. Shoot them an email, say, hey, I just submitted my application for the community board. Happy to answer any more questions you have, just wanted you to know, whatever. Because the more that they see that your interest, the more likely they are to appoint you. Okay, so more about the application. Usually on the application, you'll be asked kind of what committees you're interested in. And this isn't going to be something you're bound by. Usually when you get on the board, the chair will ask you what you're interested in, and they'll look at what committees need people. But, it helps obviously to show kind of what your passions are. And there might be a sense, maybe the borough president is looking at the composition of the board and it's like, wow, we have 10 architects, but we don't have any people who are really interested in, transportation policy. So we really want someone like that. And then you can use that opportunity too to talk about kind of why you're interested in those things. Finding a way on the application to highlight that community involvement that you've been doing to prepare yourself. Usually there's some kind of like essay questions, the long answers where you can highlight your community involvement and also show that you understand the issues in your neighborhood. And, I think showing that you are able to consider different perspectives and understand a nuanced perspective is really important. So you might have a lot of passion about one issue and feel like, there's one solution to it. But I think, kind of at least acknowledging the other side is a good way to show that you're, willing to engage in a, good conversation at a community board meeting and, wouldn't just have like your vote. And then kind of along those lines, just showing that you're open to learning about the other things, maybe that you don't know as much about, but that the community board addresses. I didn't really know much about landmarked buildings when I joined my community board. That wasn't why I joined, but I have certainly learned a lot. And, when I first joined, I kind of just said, okay, whatever the committee decided, that sounds good. But now I have my own thoughts on it and vote based on some knowledge. So show that you don't have to have that knowledge now, but that you're willing to learn. So as I mentioned, the applications are live. We've listed the deadlines here for you. And sometimes they extend them, but don't count on that. So definitely get your application in as soon as possible. And if you have any questions about any of that, we can answer that. Is that the last slide?
Yep.
Great.
So thanks, Sarah. So before we start the Q&A, I'm just Pedro, if you'd like to come on as a panelist, we'd love to hear about your experience as a public member.
Hello, can you hear me?
Pedro?
Sorry, I think I missed the last part that you were saying because we got switched.
Just,
Hi, yeah. Oh, go ahead, Sarah.
yeah, we're just interested, your perspective as a public member, if you can speak to that, because like I said, we don't have those on my board, so I don't know as much about it.
Yeah, definitely. So I am a public member for the Transportation Committee in Queens Community Board 6. And so I thought all community boards had this. I'm surprised that this is actually not something everyone had. But in short, it is just, you are essentially assigned to that one committee. You are not required. You are required to go to that committee monthly meetings, just like you would if you were in the community board. It's only one, not two, and you're not required to go to the community board's main meetings, and you're not allowed to vote there. But you can vote in the committee resolutions. You're also still you're pretty much part of it in every other kind of form. The emails, you're in the same there. You're not really special from that point of view. I remember the way that I'm gonna try to remember because it was a year ago. But I applied to be a community board member a year ago. I was not accepted. And then about a couple of weeks after that, I got an email essentially asking me like, "Hey, do you want to apply for a public member?" And I think there was also like a Twitter post by the Community Board 6. I applied to that. In there, they ask you to pick two committees. I picked transportation and parks. They put me transportation because that was my first choice. And then yeah, I've been going to every monthly meeting and also to the main meetings. And just again, like you said, just meeting people, trying to get a lay of the land.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing. So I think okay, so I'm going to get started. Thank you so much, Pedro. So I'm going to get started with the question and answer portion of our series. So our first question is anonymous, and it says, "I'd really like to get more involved to advocate for pedestrian safety, but I'm concerned about the dynamics of my local board. Do you have any recommendations for handling the challenging aspects of my community board where people are biased towards cars and parking?"
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's something I definitely experience on my community board, and from hearing other people, I think they do too. Again, going to the point that people with cars have sort of a vested interest in the status quo and the motivation to show up and keep that status quo, whereas many of us who would benefit from changes, it's kind of hard to even see that for many people. And, it's just, they don't have that kind of vested interest that car owners have. So one thing I would say is don't be ashamed of that. I think sometimes we as a movement can sort of moderate because, we're not sure how people are going to respond. I think it's important to, stay true to your values and show up and say what you believe. Especially if, there's a reason. I have small kids and they're starting to walk to school alone. So talking about my fears for their safety when they're walking to school, and when I'm walking them, I see cars running red lights all the time, and thinking about my kids walking themselves is really scary because of that. So, kind of connecting a personal story to explain why you're there and passionate, I think always kind of diffuses some of the tension. And then I would just say, trying to stay calm and, respond in, with reason and data and in a positive way, even though sometimes that can be hard when people are being very argumentative or saying things that you think are harmful, but as much as possible, trying to stay calm definitely helps.
Amazing, thank you. So we have a question in the chat from Mike that says that he's interested in learning about how community boards can help address crime in the board.
Yeah. So again, I'm not sure every community board, but I know that CB7, we have regular interactions with the police precincts in the neighborhood. So Jay was saying last time that most community boards are contiguous with one police precinct. I'm not sure about that, but ours is two, the 20th and the 24th. And the captains will regularly come to meetings to hear from us and from the community about issues. And the district manager, which Emily touched on a bit before, is really the liaison for kind of like nuts and bolts type issues. So they often work with the precincts as well. And then, you know, some boards I know do have like public safety committees as well.
Amazing. I think Mike also wants to join as a panelist there. If we could bring him on. Hi, Mike.
Hey, I'm just turning my stuff on. Hey, first of all, I just want to thank you guys for doing this. It's really helpful, informative. I found this online after I was just looking into community boards. Like I said, crime has been going on more on the street where my mom and sister live up in the Bronx, and I was concerned about it and trying to think of how we can get involved. So my question is, just I guess a point of clarification, you had mentioned earlier that like anyone can bring up a resolution, even like someone that lives on the street can say, hey, you know, this has been going on, you know, here's the police reports from these incidents that happened. I propose, I don't know, like, we'll, you know, we reach out to the local police department to have a patrol car come there or something like that. And that's something that could happen.
Yeah, I mean, you can ask the board to do it. So they might not do it,
Okay,
but you can. But I think from my experience being on the board, when a community member comes with like a specific issue and the idea for a resolution for that, like we want to address that. So, you know, it might be like, they might say, well, from our experience, this is how we can help. They might change it a bit, you know, and offer feedback. But yeah, I think we're always looking to hear from community members. Like the attendance at these meetings is often pretty low, and getting community members involved is always a priority. So when someone comes, they really want to work with you and help you find solutions for sure.
Sweet. Thank you.
Yeah.
So our next question is, what is your favorite part about being on your community board?
Interesting. Well, I think, you know, I was trying to think about it the other day, I think for 5 or 6 years. So I've learned a lot about my neighborhood. Like I said, I kind of had the issues that I really cared about when I joined the board, and I've definitely also learned more and dug deeper into those issues. But I also learned a lot about other things that I didn't necessarily know or care about before. And that's been really interesting. And just, you know, it is kind of the most local level of city government. And so it's interesting to see how it all works, and, you know, kind of the what we get from below and what we send up, and how that all works. Actually, one thing that we didn't put in the presentation, and I forgot to mention this time, one other thing that the community board does is we have an official role in the city's budget process. So each committee proposes their budget priorities, and then the board as a whole kind of ranks and agrees on our budget priorities. And then those budget priorities are sent to every agency that is relevant. And those agencies then consider those as they're putting together their proposed budgets for the next kind of fiscal year budget cycle. Obviously, they don't have to do anything we say, but you know, in terms of where they're thinking about priorities and what they're going to budget for, I think that's also a really interesting way to get involved that maybe sometimes gets overlooked, and a benefit of being on the board.
Great, thank you. So the next question is, this is great, but I'm not familiar with resolutions. Can you tell us a little bit more about them?
Yeah, I think I covered some of that earlier, and I saw that question came in early. But if people have more questions on that, happy to answer it, but I do think I covered it.
Amazing. So there's a question that says, if there's any specific questions about the application, you're welcome to reach out to me, and I can forward that to Sarah if needed. We'll be sending a follow-up email tomorrow, and we'll include all our emails there. So the next question is, roughly how much of a time commitment do you believe a community board is per month?
Yeah, so like I said, officially there's 3 meetings you have to go to, and I think it depends probably on what committee you're on, how sort of contentious the issues are. and how many resolutions like they like to do a month. So I think Jay mentioned that his committee meetings might be more like an hour. Mine are usually more like 2 hours, sometimes closer to 3. So that would be like, let's say 4 hours a month just on your 2 committee meetings. And then there's the full board meeting, which again, it sort of depends, I guess, on how well your board is run. Jay mentioned that his board is run pretty efficiently. So maybe their full board meetings only take maybe 3 hours. Mine can take more like 4 hours, depending on, again, what issues are on the agenda, how contentious they are, how much kind of conversation and discussion there's going to be. So I would budget for yourself probably like 8 hours a month on meetings. And then it just sort of depends. Like if you're a committee chair, if you're on the executive committee, of course, you're going to have more responsibilities and more hours devoted. If you want to really read up on resolutions beforehand, find data and evidence, those, obviously those things will add time. And then occasionally for my committee, transportation committee, we will also sort of task ourselves with going out into the neighborhood to observe conditions, or, we're doing right now, like everyone has been assigned a bike lane to kind of ride or walk on and see how that feels for them. So we can come back and be more, aware of the conditions. So it sort of depends. You can do the more minimum, or you can get more involved.
Amazing, thank you. So we're going to bring on Gabriel to ask his next question. Hi, Gabriel.
Hello. Hey. Yeah. So my question was basically just how much power do community boards have in the zoning process? So do they have do they serve an advisory role, or do they have final say over things? And I was basically concerned in like how it works with respect to variances or just changes to zoning for areas of the neighborhood the community board serves.
Yeah, great question. So officially, everything the community board does is advisory. Even like the liquor licenses, the state liquor authority doesn't have to do what the community board says. That said, most agencies listen, they listen to what the community board says. And I think that that is actually particularly true in a lot of like zoning variances cases. We've had we did like a special zoning district on the Upper West Side that was really led by the community board. They kind of started the process and that went through. It was a kind of a down zoning. So, they do have a lot of power over that stuff, even if it's not official. Sorry, I don't want to talk too technical for people who don't know about it, but there's a process called ULURP, the Uniform Land Use Review Procedure. When something goes through ULURP, like if a developer wants to build higher than they're allowed to by their zoning, they have to get a variance or a rezoning, and that goes before the community board. Then it goes before the borough president, the landmarks preservation committee, or city planning, and the council. And unless there's like really strong interest one way or the other, usually, the council member city planning will kind of go along with the community board. And then because we have member deference on the council, that kind of, puts the whole thing in motion. There obviously are exceptions to the rule, but I think in general, they have a lot of power. Yeah.
Thanks.
Which is a great reason, not a transportation reason, but more of a housing reason to absolutely get involved.
Right. All right. Thanks for bringing me on.
Yeah.
Thanks, Gabriel. So our next question is from Bobby. Bobby, Eric, if you could bring him up as a panelist. Hi, Bobby.
Hello. Thanks. Not sure if this was answered, might have not heard it, but I was wondering if community board members are able to participate fully if they can only participate remotely. And if there's any, is that done because some community boards are more technically savvy than others? Is there any requirement, that they have to? I have seen them online as a viewing thing, but I was just wondering from if you were on the community board and you could only meet at that time remotely, if that was a thing you can participate in.
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, quickly before I answer it, it reminds me of something I forgot to mention earlier when we're talking about, community boards not being representative. That's also true in terms of like who attends a community board meeting, right? They're at like 6 p.m. on a weeknight. If you have young kids and you're trying to get them dinner and in a bath and to bed, it's hard for you to attend. Older kids and you're doing homework, if you don't have childcare, there also usually isn't kind of language access. So for people who English is not their first language, it might be harder for them to participate. So there's lots of reasons why they are non-inclusive, and that also goes for board members. Like the people who can commit 3 to 4 hours on a Tuesday night are not, that's not a lot of people. When we're talking about whether we should have a bike lane in a neighborhood, and the deliveristas obviously really want that safety improvement, they're not showing up at a 6 p.m. meeting to express their opinion because they are out working. So there's a lot of accessibility issues there. So I will say my community board has been on Zoom since the start of the pandemic, and we still are, and we've seen a lot more participation while we've been on Zoom. But the open meetings law requires that meetings be held in person, in public, open to the public. And the interpretation of that is that outside of this emergency order they have to be in person. There is a kind of new rule that they might be able to be hybrid, so that you'd have to have a quorum of members attending in person, and then a member could attend virtually, but they might have to have some kind of legitimate reason, whatever that is. So that's a little bit still in flux, but on the whole, I would say you're probably going to have to be able to commit to going in person. In terms of it, like just as a member of the public, there is no requirement for them to be live streamed or put up on YouTube or anything like that. CB7 has been doing that for a long time, thanks to a former board member, Rich Robbins, who was like way ahead of the curve on that. And I think there definitely are some boards who are getting up to speed on that, especially since the pandemic and we all went virtual. It was like, oh, we should be, putting this up, but not every community board does, for sure.
Thank you.
Awesome. So our next question is, so Sarah, you mentioned that one way to get involved outside of being on the board is attending meetings or chatting with board members to volunteer with their office. Are there other ways to volunteer or stay involved in the same way?
Yeah. So specifically in terms of community boards, there's attending, obviously. And then some community boards will also have task forces, which sometimes are just internal for board members and sometimes are open, they'll have like public members as well of the task force. A few years ago, CB7, we had a Broadway task force thinking about how to reimagine Broadway in our district. And we had many members of the public who participated in that, along with members of the board. So you could try and find out if we have a NYCHA task force, for example, in bringing in NYCHA residents to share their issues. So you can try and find out if there's something like that. And then I think the question also kind of goes to other ways just generally in the community to get involved. So I'd mentioned reaching out to your council member's office. I think most council members are excited for volunteers because they have a lot to do and more than they can, kind of handle on their own. So just reaching out and seeing if there are ways you can help. Sometimes there's they might want help with constituent services. I remember Helen Rosenthal used to run a housing clinic, and so she'd have people come and volunteer to help with that. I mentioned participatory budgeting, that at least in the District 6 requires a lot of volunteers to run. So I think just continuing to look around and explore ways in your neighborhood to get involved is always a great opportunity.
Awesome, thanks. And so the last question, which I think you already touched on, but is it better to attend in person or remotely? But
yeah, I mean, I will say, obviously it depends if the, board even is doing it by Zoom. And while I mentioned that we've had increased participation over Zoom, I do think there's been a bit less collegiality over Zoom. It's easier when it's just sort of a face in a, one little Zoom window to dehumanize a bit. So, I have mixed feelings about it. I think there's a lot of accessibility benefits of being on Zoom. And then there are some, like I said, loss of collegiality. I think being in person, it's harder to, accuse someone of being a, shill for the real estate industry when you're looking at them and they have a job and, kids at home. So the pros and cons, I guess.
Amazing, thank you. So Jacob has another question. It says, I'm specifically curious about whether, are there any rules and regulations about who can serve as a community board member? I'm specifically curious whether city employees can serve and whether holding a position as a city employee will help or hurt an application.
Yes, city employees can serve. There is a very specific conflict of interest board policy. So for example, we have some employees of the Department of Education on our board. And so like some education resolutions, they're fine to vote on, but if it's like very specific about like a policy of the DOE or something, they usually will recuse themselves and not vote. There may be like one or two kinds of city employees, like if you're an employee of the borough president, for example, you might not be able to serve, but generally I think you can, whether it helps or hurts. Again, I think it kind of depends on what it is. I think that having some employees of the DOE, probably that was helpful for them because, they bring a very specific insight. We have tons of schools in our district. So, having that perspective was important. And then I would say more generally, the conflict of interest rules, you are not allowed to vote on a resolution in which you have financial interest at stake. So for example, there's a member of our community board who is a commercial real estate broker. That's a really interesting perspective to have on the board. He can bring us information about, small businesses in our district. That's great. But he often represents, a tenant or landlord that is up for like, say, a liquor license, or they're trying to put up a new sign that requires like a landmarks variance. So he has to recuse himself on those issues. We've had some heated conversations about advocates and whether they have to recuse themselves. And the conflict of interest board is very clear that unless you are like getting paid based on the results of a bike lane resolution, you are allowed to vote on it. So, being an advocate, Reynoso said at an event last night, I believe it was, that you should put on your application in the Brooklyn community. If you're applying for a Brooklyn community board, you should put in your application if you are a member of TA or work on, bike lane issues, because he wants those people on the board. So that in Brooklyn, yes, for sure, that helps.
Amazing. So I think those are all the questions that we have for today. Thank you all so much for joining us for part 1 of our webinar series on community boards. We will be hosting part 2 and part 3 in March and May, so stay tuned for those. We'll send out a follow-up email tomorrow and provide some more information on that. So thank you again, Sarah. Thank you all for joining and have a great night.
Yeah, I'll just really, I was just going to close by saying, as we kind of mentioned, all the ways that this is important. I just really, really encourage you to apply. You might not make it this year, but having that record of applying, you can apply. I had to apply twice. So, just do it, put in your application. And even if you don't get in this year, you might get in next year. So, and reach out to us with any questions. It's so important that people apply to their community boards. So thank you so much.
Thank you all.
In a slow diagonal fashion, on the Sabbath